The best thing about writing short stories is you can tell a short story that's pretty dark and then ends with a final twist of the knife. Most of the stories in Full Throttle are horror stories, and I always view them as like going on a dark ride at a carnival. You're spun through the darkness and all the frights leap out at you and shock you, and you scream half the way through the ride, and then suddenly you're ejected back out into the daylight laughing. And I always hope a short story will give people that feeling. I'm Joe Hill, the author of Heart-Shaped Box, Nosferatu, and most recently a collection of short stories titled Full Throttle. The brief bio, I guess, would be that I come from a family of writers, and my parents are Stephen and Tabitha King. I began writing when I was 13 years old. It just seemed like what you were supposed to do, was what my parents did. And when I was in college, I started to think, if I write as Joseph King, I might be in danger of getting something lousy published because an unscrupulous publisher sees a chance to make a quick buck in the last name. So I dropped the last name, I started writing as Joe Hill, and I was able to keep it a secret for about a decade. And I wrote a bunch of stories. And the new book, Full Throttle, is my first return to short stories since then. It's got these 13 stories in it, and 2 of them I wrote with my dad, the first one and the second to the last, In the Tall Grass. It's about a brother and sister. They're on a cross-country trip. They pull over to the side of the road by a field of towering stalks of grass. They hear a child screaming out in the weeds. And they plunge into the grass looking for him, and soon discover that out in that field, time and space don't operate in their normal way. And Vincenzo Natali, who directed Cube, he grabbed it and made a terrific film on Netflix about it. Ferociously scary. The story is dark and scary, and things get bad, and then they get worse. Then the world of the movie expands, and it becomes a kind of gory, hayseed inception. The very first story that really sank its teeth into me, or collection of stories, was a book called Bring on the Bad Guys. It was published by Marvel Comics. Most of the stories were written by Stan Lee. They were superhero stories, but they were really focused on archetypal villains, characters like the Abomination and the Dread Dormammu, grinning, lurid psychopaths who made unreasonable demands and bit their enemies in the face. And I could relate to all of them because I was only about 6 years old and I wanted to do all those things too. So my dad read those stories to me, and also one of the first comic books I read to myself was called You Will Believe in Ghosts, and I was obsessed with that book. So in some ways, it was almost inevitable that I wound up writing ghost stories. You know, the die was sort of cast early. In terms of my favorite villains, I think Joaquin Phoenix in The Joker is probably the best portrayal of a psychopath in the history of superhero films. Pennywise, in some ways, is a monster from horror who has reached the scale of Dracula or the Mummy. And I was thinking, what's interesting about Pennywise is he's a boggart from the Harry Potter stories. He's the kind of monster that the third years at Hogwarts could quite easily dispel, you know, no trouble at all. But us muggles, unfortunately, you know, he can shred through us like hot knife through butter. My secret weapon is a blend of tea called Mystical Creatures. It's a private blend made by a hotel in New York City. They arrange it through a company called Wedgwood, which also does plates and glasses, and it's the one tea that Wedgwood offers. It's a mix of black teas, green teas. I think it's got a little oolong in it, a little touch of jasmine. It's got body, it's got a sense of authority to it, but it also has some nice, light, sweet grace notes. So that would be sort of my preferred cup. I've thought a lot about this over the years. Why do people want to be scared? Why do they want to read horror stories? The simplest description is we evolved to cope with a menacing environment, to face serious potential threats to our life and to the tribe. But in the safe playground of fiction, you can imagine being attacked by a vampire. That's a horrible thing to wrestle with and to think about, and yet some part of us evolved to prepare for dire and grim scenarios. And when we read something like a vampire story, we can metaphorically wrestle with those threats to our lives in a way that perversely is fun, that we find terrifically entertaining, a relief and exciting. And when we're in a real life situation where we find ourselves menaced in some way, I think that rehearsal is what we draw on, the stuff that we learn from horror movies and horror novels and frightening stories. That's very useful, and it's one of the reasons for our success as a creature.